I understand that the situation remains tense between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The Israel Defense Forces have been carrying out a series of operations and strikes targeting Hamas and militant targets in the Gaza Strip in an effort to neutralize threats and prevent additional attacks against Israel. It is evident that the raids and attacks are focusing on strategic sites, including command centers, rocket launch sites, and weapons depots belonging to militant groups. These moves are intended to weaken Hamas's operational capabilities and deter any attempted additional attacks on Israel from Gaza. The tunnels have historically been a major challenge for Israel, as they have been used by militant groups to hide, store weapons, and carry out operations. These underground tunnels are a critical target in Israel's defense strategy, and considerable resources have been dedicated to detecting and neutralizing this type of clandestine infrastructure. However, it is important to note that military actions in this region can also trigger responses and escalations from the opposition, which could increase tension and conflict in the region. The challenge lies in finding a balance between Israel's security and mitigating risks of retaliation and potential increases in violence. The approach proposed by military expert Chris Morris of using wastewater to detect and potentially eliminate militants hiding in underground tunnels is certainly an unconventional strategy. The idea is based on Egypt's previous use of sewage to seal smuggling tunnels between the Sinai and Gaza in the past. This tactic, if implemented, could represent a challenge for militants hiding in the tunnels, as the use of wastewater could make it difficult for them to remain and effectively deploy in these underground spaces. However, it is worth considering that, although it may be an effective solution from a military perspective, the use of wastewater in this context raises important humanitarian concerns. The method could further exacerbate the already critical humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, where millions of people already face extremely difficult conditions. Additionally, this strategy could raise ethical and moral concerns about the treatment of civilians and the overall impact on the population, as wastewater contamination could have devastating consequences for public health and the environment. It is essential to take into account both the potential benefits and the humanitarian and ethical implications when considering the feasibility and implementation of this type of strategy in a conflict as complex as the one in Gaza. The description of the use of schools as multifunctional centers in the midst of the conflict between Israeli troops and Hamas is worrying. The fact that classrooms, originally places of education, have now become spaces used for a variety of military purposes, illustrates the stark reality of how armed conflict affects civilian communities and basic institutions. Schools that have been transformed into command centers, weapons warehouses, and housing for military personnel demonstrate the devastating impacts of war on daily life and civilian infrastructure. The damage suffered by these educational sites, including bullet holes and bombing damage, is a sad reminder of the violence that prevails in the region. Lieutenant Colonel Tomer's account of the operations of the 50 Battalion and its trajectory from southern Israel to the northern border, and finally to the Gaza Strip, highlights the intensity and breadth of military mobilization in response to the threats posed by armed groups in the region. The complexity of military missions, which include coordination between different teams and adaptation to multiple environments, underscores the challenges and risks faced by military forces in a protracted and constantly evolving conflict. However, it is also important to remember that these types of narratives are a fraction of the overall picture of the conflict, and that behind these military operations there are civilian communities that suffer the most devastating impacts. The use of civilian institutions for military purposes is a reflection of the urgent need to protect civilians and safeguard educational and welfare institutions in conflict zones. Tomer's account of operations in northern Gaza and the difficulties in effectively using tanks in densely populated areas, such as refugee camps, highlights the tactical challenges faced by military forces in a restricted urban environment. The description of the consolidation of Israeli control in northern Gaza, marked by the presence of flags and the introduction of infrastructure, suggests an attempt to secure the newly occupied areas and provide basic services to deployed forces. The tragic incident that resulted in the death of Captain Benny Wise and wounded soldiers in a clash with Hamas members underscores the dangerousness and unpredictability of fighting in the region. The ambush tactic employed by Hamas militants highlights their ability to operate on familiar terrain and their ability to adapt to different conflict scenarios. Tomer's comment on the evasive and adaptive nature of the enemy, comparing it to a mouse that moves and adapts according to circumstances, illustrates the complexity of facing an adversary that benefits from its knowledge of the terrain and evasion and concealment tactics. This narrative provides a look at the operational environment and tactical strategies used by Israeli forces and militant groups in Gaza, evidencing the complexity and intensity of the conflict in the region. However, it is important to highlight that these operations come at a significant human cost and underline the need to seek peaceful solutions and a long-term diplomatic resolution to the ongoing conflict. During a period of 5 hours, between 11 and 20 militants were reported dead, while our forces suffered no human losses. During the advance in the area, soldiers discovered multiple tunnels and a huge amount of weapons belonging to Hamas. The most notable thing for everyone was the significant amount of weapons under the control of said group, underlining the strategic relevance of these tunnels in the transfer of weapons to Gaza, which would be practically impossible without these underground passages. In the final days of fighting in Shati, Battalion 50 eliminated at least 13 Hamas members, with only a few directly involved in fighting, while the rest participated in preventive activities. The clearing operation in Shati, now surrounded by armored forces, has been carried out cautiously due to the presence of explosive traps and the risk of ambushes prepared by Hamas. In parallel to these clashes, there has been positive progress in communication services in Gaza, restoring limited telephone and internet services. This was possible thanks to the distribution of fuel that allowed the reactivation of the generators that feed these networks. Israel has also announced authorization for 2 United Nations fuel tankers to enter Gaza daily, benefiting communication systems. We appreciate the constant monitoring of our information.